In this video, I'm going to talk about the origins and the early campaigns of World War II. In World War II, we see the nationalism of the 19th century combined with the superstates whose development we explored in the last set of material. So you take socialism or fascism combined with the nationalism of the 19th century, combined with industrialization, and you have World War II, the ongoing industrialization that's taken place since World War I. World War II is a more connected war, a more industrialized war. The governments are more powerful, and we see individuals become more marginalized. We see a society in which the state is everything and in which all resources in the state are devoted to the war. All individuals in the state are somehow caught up in the war. And we see its origins in the late 1930s, where Japan is already on the move, attacking China and attempting to expand into the Pacific to gain the raw materials that it needs in order to fund its increasingly industrialized empire. This expansion is going to lead to a rivalry between Japan and the United States. The United States has already registered its disapproval of Japan's invasion of China. It's already beginning to provide some aid for the Chinese to fight against the Japanese. So you have the beginnings of the conflict there. In Europe, we have German expansion, the Nazi takeover of Austria, shortly afterwards the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia, and then the invasion of Poland, partitioned with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union reclaimed some of the territories it gave up at the end of World War I, and this leads to World War II. It's after the German invasion of Poland that England and France declare war on Germany. Now, the Germans are going to be very successful in the first months of the war because of their deployment of a new means of fighting war called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And here we see that the strategy, human intelligence, has caught up with the technology in a way that wasn't present at World War I. In World War I, we had these new technologies, but we had old-fashioned strategies, and so you had a stalemate. And up until that point, the idea was that you would, or a sort of basic overarching strategy, was that you would launch your strongest forces against the enemy strong point, capture the enemy strong point, and then you move on and you drive the enemy back. The German Blitzkrieg is based on using air supremacy to have control of the battlefield, and then instead of attacking an enemy strong point, to attack an enemy weak point, to penetrate that weak point with tanks and other fast-moving aspects of military equipment, and after penetrating the weak point, to encircle the opposing army and to render the strong point useless. And so the Germans employ this tactic to conquer very quickly Scandinavia, giving them access to ports into the Atlantic, which will mean that they won't get blockaded in by the English in the way that they did in the First World War, and access to raw materials, in particular steel, from Sweden, which remains neutral throughout the war. The Germans then employ these tactics in France, again with great success, and managed to knock the French out of the war, managed to defeat and conquer France. The British Army is only saved through the evacuation of most of its forces at Dunkirk, and I provide a video that talks about this operation in more detail. Hitler then offers Britain peace so that he can turn to his great next object, the conquest of Russia, or the invasion of Russia. Britain refuses Hitler's offer of peace and fights on, and Hitler's attempt to invade Britain is known as the Battle of Britain. Once again, the beginnings of a German invasion tactic is to gain air supremacy. However, in this instance, because the German air squadrons are having to fly quite a long way to get over Britain, and therefore have less fuel and less maneuverability when they are there, and partly because the British are using radar to predict or to know in advance where the Germans are attacking, the Germans are never able to gain this air supremacy. And knowing that any invasion force will be destroyed from the air, Hitler has to call off this attack. In the Battle of Britain, we see German efforts to destroy civilian morale by attacking civilian targets. in order to put pressure on the British to make peace with the Germans. And so here we see a good example of the sort of total war of World War II in a way that's very different from World War I, where World War I, everything was really fought in France. And now British civilians, people who are miles away from the front lines of the fighting, are still being wounded and even killed by these attacks that are aimed directly at them. It's not an accident. It's a part of attacking Britain on the part of the Germans to attack British civilians and what people who previously would have been considered non-combatants. In the Mediterranean, the British have to defend the Suez Canal. It's the source of their raw materials that are coming from their colonies, especially from India, raw materials that they need to continue fighting this war. And so they defend their territory in Egypt against German offensives. And they do so successfully. It's a sign of how significant Britain knew control of the Suez Canal, control of these trading routes was to their success in the war, that even when Hitler was poised to invade Britain, the British were sending half their tanks over to Egypt to fight in this conflict and to defend their control of Egypt against the Germans. The other area, the other theater of war at this time in the early years of the war is the theater of the North Atlantic. Britain is trying to blockade Germany again, trying to blockade Germany from receiving the supplies it needs to fight this war. And all supplies, again, it's total war. It's not just a blockade on military supplies, which have been traditional in the past. It was a blockade on all supplies. So again, people who previously were considered non-combatants were starting to feel the force of the war. And the Germans responded by using U-boats to attack British shipping. And this is really very serious. Britain at the time has a high population density. They're not able to feed themselves. They rely on food that comes from the United States and from Canada. And if the U-boat campaign had been successful, then the British would have been basically starved into surrender. And it's the fact that they have American support, that American merchant ships bring supplies to England, American and Canadian merchant ships, and that Americans and Canadians provide escorts for these English ships. And many American and Canadian sailors are already dying in this conflict, being wounded and dying in this conflict, even though their countries haven't entered the war yet. But their sacrifice, again, is going to be crucial. It's crucial to the survival of Britain and the eventual victory of the Allies. I'll be back with more videos about World War II later in this chapter.